Quite often, you will hear about templates being used with a DAW, and so I have set up a relatively simple, at least in orchestral terms, template. In my case here, the template is basically a collection of individual tracks, each containing an instrument, and adding up to a complete set of instruments that I would like to use from within my project, and I have saved that as a setup. Having done this once, obviously it is very quick to simply load the template and start working, without having to look through your libraries and load individual instruments, by which time you may have already lost the idea you were thinking of recording. Especially in the case of an orchestral library, it is clear that there are certain instruments that will almost always be required within your musical context. The other thing to remember is that even if the template you load is not exactly what you want, it is a relatively simple thing to modify the template with the instruments you may need, and it will still save you time in the long run. This exact template will be used later in our tutorial to demonstrate our epic trailer chapter. If we look at the template I have created here, we see that there are folder tracks, and within these folder tracks we have individual instruments. For example, in the woodwinds track, we have 3 instruments. Obviously, this isn't a complete woodwind section, but for what we need, these 3 instruments are enough. One thing to note is that each instrument track contains one sound. It would be possible to have multi-timbral instruments for each track, but to be honest, to begin with, this would just be confusing. And also, with the CPU power and RAM storage of modern instruments, it's not really a problem to have individual instruments on individual tracks. If we look in the contact player, we could simply drag extra instruments into the player window and create a multi-timbral track with individual outputs and MIDI channels. But as mentioned, this isn't necessary in reality. Now, I'll open the brass track, and we can see that there are instruments from a variety of libraries, for example the Albion brass and orchestral elements libraries, as well as the session horns. One thing worth doing is color coding the tracks correctly, and also naming each individual track properly. This will save you a lot of headaches further down the line. Not only do you have a good overview of the tracks, but once you record patterns, they will be given the correct name of the instrument track they were recorded on, so you will see which patterns belong to which instruments. Now, if we move on to the strings and multi track, we also see a selection of sounds from a selection of libraries. But I have called the track strings and multi because some of the instruments are layered instruments, so multiple instruments that are controlled with the expression pedal. So for example, if we play the orchestral elements full orc high track, we can hear that I am controlling the individual elements of this multi-layered instrument with my expression pedal. Of course, if you don't need so many instruments in a project, you can simply remove them from the template, or in some DAWs, you can hide them. In any case, you need to retain a clear overview of your workspace, so hiding or removing instruments you will not be using can certainly help with that. If we quickly jump back to our strings section, we would imagine that something like the OE full orc high track would be very useful when creating our basic arrangement or deciding on our fundamental harmonies. In some cases, a template could have hundreds of tracks, as we can imagine that if we were to use each individual instrument of the orchestra with all of those instruments' options, such as staccato or legato, each having its own track, then the number of tracks on display would be immense. So being able to hide or remove unnecessary tracks is somewhat useful. Next, we can look at the percussion instruments, and here once again we see a selection of instruments from a variety of libraries. And once again, the ones you choose will probably be the ones that you will use the most often. Now, in my drum track, I have loaded the Damage Crunch Kit, and this is not a typical orchestral drum kit, but more a hybrid kit that will allow me to demonstrate how a different type of instrument can be included within an orchestral arrangement. Next, we have a separate cymbals track with 5 instruments. I could have included these in the percussion track, but to keep things clear, we have a folder track called Cymbals. This also gives us the advantage of being able to mix them differently on their own track within the DAW. If they were in the percussion folder and I was to add reverb, the reverb would also affect the percussion instruments, and they will probably require less reverb than the cymbals. Now we have the Loops folder track, which contains non-orchestral instruments again. But as we are trying to show a hybrid orchestral situation, it is important to have such instruments in our template. And next up is the Drum Effects folder track, and this has a variety of affected drum sounds. These come not just from orchestral libraries, but from other more atmospheric libraries, such as the OE Drones and Risers library, which offers these atmospheric sounds as well as swells and reverse type atmospherics. Next we have the Nexus instrument, and this is an instrument that comes more from the techno field, but can certainly be used in a hybrid orchestra, especially when extra or third-party patches are used. It is also clear that orchestral music is no longer stuck in the past and can include more modern sounds and instruments such as Nexus. The next group track is called Pads, and this is once again using the Nexus instrument, but with pad sounds. And following this, we have another Nexus track with modern rhythmic elements. These are elements that are not typically orchestral, but are being used in modern orchestral productions. And next, we have another track with more rhythmical elements that may be relevant to your productions. The tracks have been laid out in a logical manner. This is important. The tracks I would use the most are at the top of the screen, and moving down, we get to the tracks I will perhaps use less often. Of course, if you start working and decide that you're heading more into a modern direction, and the typical classical instruments may be less present in your production, you can simply drag your tracks to rearrange them, and reorder them in order of your preference. One of the major time-saving elements of a template is that you can already create a sort of premix of your individual tracks. With this, I mean that you can create a balance of the individual sounds using volume, panning, and effects. This means you will have a good sound from the start, and will not have to waste time adding reverbs and placing instruments in the stereo space before getting down to working. Looking at the mixer window, we can see that the volumes have been adjusted dependent on each individual instrument. The panning, however, is relatively central, and the reason for this is that most of the libraries will already include panning information within the patches. Here you can see with the cymbals, however, I have panned them slightly to the right, but in general the panning is left alone. Now we come on to the topic of effects. I would recommend, at least to start with, to just use the ambience settings that come with your instruments. The reason for this is that you may not know what setting is required for your work, and so it doesn't really make sense to have, for example, a large hall reverb on everything, if it ends up that your orchestral arrangement is meant to sound as if it's in a chapel. Of course, you can adjust from within your individual libraries the depth of reverb if you wish to. In addition to this large mixer that shows all of the individual instruments, we also have a group mixer. And this doesn't show the individual instruments, but the separate groups of instruments, with the advantage being that I can keep the balance of all the instruments within, say, the brass section, but I can adjust the overall level of that section in relation to all other instruments. On top of this, I can now add effects to the groups rather than the individual instruments. In addition to these groups, the last three groups that we can see, those of drums, orchestral and hybrid, are actually groups of these groups. And we can see this up here in the routing section. Here we can see that the strings, woodwinds, brass, percussion and cymbals all belong to the orchestral group. This means I can adjust the level of all of those groups by simply adjusting the orchestral group fader. I have done the same thing for the hybrid instruments, and they appear in the hybrid group master here. And we have the same for the drums, although this simply contains the drums group for the minute. But if I was to add a drum machine, for example, I could put it in this group. Obviously, I can also not just adjust the levels here, but add overall reverb or dynamics or other effects to everything included in these groups. To do this, we can simply insert a reverb on the group we want to add reverb to. Once you have got to this stage, you should not forget to save your templates under Save as Template, or you can also save it as a project. Once this is done, you can simply load the template or project, which may take a minute or two depending on how many instruments you include in your template, and then you can start working straight away. Another thing worth mentioning is that your group tracks also appear on the Arrange window and can be automated just like any other track. Your templates may end up being very different to the one presented here, and templates will also evolve as you add instruments. But they are without doubt a great way to streamline your workflow.